Typically, loading data into a data warehouse or other destination requires some preparation before you can insert the first rows into a table. If you're loading into a staging table, you may need to remove data that remains from the last batch insert. If you're trying to improve performance during the insert, you may want to drop indexes or disable constraints. You may also want to rebuild indexes or re-enable constraints when the load's complete. If so, you'll find the Execute SQL task very useful. This task lets you execute SQL statements or stored procedures from your package. To use this task, you'll need to configure a minimum number of properties, including the connection type, connection, and SQL statement. To configure the connection type and connection properties, you need to configure a connection manager for a data source by using the connection property of the task. The Execute SQL task supports several different types of data source connections. One is Excel. And this is used by the task to create and modify Excel workbooks. If you execute a SQL statement against this provider, it treats individual Excel worksheets as table. So it's sort of a pseudo database, if you will. You can also use the OLEDB data provider. And this is commonly used for SQL Server and other relational sources. But it can also be used for any data source for which an OLEDB provider exists. And then there's an ODBC. And then you can also use ODBC. This is used to connect to data sources for which an ODBC driver is available. There's a lot of overlap between what's available for ODBC and OLEDB. For the most part, if there is an OLEDB driver available, you should use that instead of ODBC. But there's a lot of older data stores that only have ODBC drivers. Then you can also use ADO and ADO.NET, some of Microsoft's .NET and pre.NET data access technologies. And there's a SQL Mobile option, which lets you connect to SQL Server Compact Edition. And that was formerly called SQL Server Mobile Edition. So the data provider has saved that old name. Now, you don't need to create a connection manager from within the task editor. You can also create a connection manager directly by right-clicking on the connection manager surface at the bottom of the designer screen and selecting the appropriate connection type. And then you can use that connection for the Execute SQL task. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you define these connection managers. Then once you create the connection manager, you can move on to setting up the SQL statement properties of the Execute SQL task. And in this case, you can enter the SQL statements that an Execute SQL task is going to execute directly into the editor for the task. Or you can put them in a package variable, or you can put them in an external file that the task will read at runtime. Now, using external files to hold your SQL statements really is a mixed bag. It can let multiple packages reuse scripts without adding maintenance headaches. But it can also mean more items to keep track of when you deploy your package to test and production servers. If you do decide to keep your scripts in external files, be sure to document them carefully so that your operations team understands the purpose of those additional files. They don't get left behind, because that'll cause errors within your package. What I'm going to do now is create a new package that resets a table to clear out its contents and then sets its identity seed to a new fixed value. So what I'm going to do first is create and then use a new custom human resources.newhires table. And I'm going to put that in AdventureWorks 2012. Then I'll create that new package in order to import data from an Excel spreadsheet and examine the results by running a query in Management Studio. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to manually create that new hires table. I could perform this step within the package, but the idea here is that the table is always there, so this is just a setup step. Okay, so I'm going to double click on that file there, and that'll fire up Management Studio. And I'll connect to a local instance once again. And there's the script. So as you can see, it's going to use the AdventureWorks 2012 database, and then checks to see if it exists or not, and then execute this create table statement in order to create that table with this data. So I'll go ahead and execute that. All right, command completed successfully, and now we have the table. Okay, that's the setup step. So now I'm going to go into SQL Server Data Tools. Now I have Visual Studio 2012 installed in this machine, so it's hosted within that instance. And I'll come up here and do a File, New, Project. Make sure that I'm in Integration Services, and I want to use this project. In fact, if I expand this a little bit, you can see that this is the project, and this is an import project. So I want this project right there. And I'm going to give this project the name Execute SQL. Not typically a great name for a project because this is just identifying a single task that this package is going to do. And it is a simple package, but generally you're going to want to have something more meaningful about the function of the overall package as opposed to the name of a single task. But it works for our purposes here. Okay, so I'm going to put this in samples and control flow right there. And use all the other defaults. And it creates that package and project and opens up this Getting Started dialog box. Okay, and you can read that. That's going to pop up until you close it, so just leave it closed now. All right, over here in Solution Explorer, I want to give the package a little bit more meaningful name. So I can either click this again or right-click it and select Rename. And I'm going to call this Execute SQL as well. Okay. Just be sure to give your packages meaningful names. And there you can see the change took effect there. Okay, I'm going to go over here to the SSIS toolbox. And as you see, Execute SQL is one of the favorites. Just because this is so commonly used, Microsoft decided that it was worthwhile putting in an out-of-the-box installation or fresh installation of data tools. It puts Execute SQL task here in favorites. But you can move it around, remove it, whatever you want to do. So I'm just going to double click on that, and that puts it there in the package. Now notice that it appears with this red X icon. And that appears because I haven't yet configured it. And there's some required settings. The designer sees that I haven't configured the task yet, and so it reminds me of that. So if I tried to execute the package now, it wouldn't execute because it sees that this component has not been configured yet. All right, so I'm going to open up the Execute SQL Task Editor. So I can either double-click on the task, or I can right-click on it and select Edit. Either way works. You get to the same place with this dialog box. First thing I want to do is give this task a little bit more meaningful name. So what this is going to be doing is resetting the staging table. So I'll just call it Reset Staging Table. Now, finally, I've used a very meaningful name that's appropriate for this specific task. And then I can also add a description here. In this case, I'm just going to get rid of that there. That's kind of meaningless. But typically you'll want to add a description, an overall description of what this package is doing. All right, now renaming a task isn't really necessary. You can use the generic names, but now we need to get into the required changes. And the first thing we need to do is set up a connection for this task, because this is going to be connecting to a SQL Server instance. All right, so down here we have a connection type of OnlyDB. And you can see that all of those different options we have available that I talked about. But I'm going to leave OnlyDB because that's the most appropriate connection type for a SQL Server. And then I'm going to go to the connection property here. And if I have any existing connections, they'll appear there. I don't, so I need to click on New Connection. And that opens up this Configure OnlyDB Connection Manager. So at this point, you may or may not have existing data connections. It just depends on what work you've done with integration services in this instance of data tools. So as you can see, I have an existing connection to the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database, but that's not what I want to use. I want the full AdventureWorks 2012. So I'll click on New, and that opens up this connection manager that is specifically tailored for connections to SQL servers. All right, server name is local, but I can connect to a remote server as well, or I can use this machine name. whatever's appropriate. Then I can set the credentials. Windows login, Windows authentication works for me because I'm a sysadmin on this instance of SQL Server. So I'm going to use that. But if I needed to use a SQL Server authentication, I could select that and put in the credentials. And then I want to connect to a database, specifically AdventureWorks 2012. Then I can test the connection. With these kind of connections, this is mostly going to make sure that I can connect to it using my Windows authentication, my Windows credentials. But it's really handy if I put in a username and password so it validates that and makes sure that I can connect using those settings. So everything's fine, and I'll click on OK. And now we have this local AdventureWorks 2012 data connection. And it's selected, so I'll click on OK, and that selects it as that connection now here within the Execute SQL Task Editor. Next thing I need to do is specify the SQL that I want to execute. So as you can see, there's a SQL source type property here. And the options that I have are direct input, file connection, or variable. Those are those options that I talked about earlier. So the file connection, it's in some external file, or if I have a variable defined within this package or accessible within the scope of this task, I could put the SQL statement within that variable. But in this case, I'm going to leave the setting to direct input because I'm going to define the SQL statement right here within the property. And at this point, I can just select this and start typing away, or I can use the ellipsis button to open up this dialog box. It's obviously not a full-scale SQL query editor or anything like that, but it's a text box. It's a little bit easier if you have a longer, more involved SQL statement that you're going to be typing in. It's a little bit easier to keep track of where you are and see the whole thing rather than just a single text box on that form. So more often you'll probably want to use this. All right, so I'm going to type in. So I'm going to do a truncate table, and it's going to be human resources dot new hires. Okay, so that's just using the transact SQL truncate table statement. I'm going to empty out all of the existing rows there. And then I'm also going to reset the identity value. So I'll do a db check ident and do it on human resources new hires. And I want to reseed it, and I want to set the starting seed to 100. Widen this a bit so you can see more of that. Okay. So all this is going to do is it's going to reset the identity values for that particular table. So each time that I execute this code, in other words, each time I execute this package, because this is going to be the only thing within the package, then it's going to truncate the contents and then reseed the identity value so that the new rows that are inserted using identity fields are going to start at the value 100. Now, more typically, I'm going to set that to 1, but I wanted to be able to demonstrate what was going on with that. So I selected 100. And this works, of course, because the new hires table does have an identity value, which is employee ID. Okay, I'm done writing code, so I'll click on OK, and there it appears within the window. And as you can see, I can hover over it and see, well, for just 2 statements, it shows it all. But if I have much more complex SQL Server or SQL statements, it probably is not all going to be visible. Now, there's a lot of other things that I can do in order to configure this task. So there's a few more properties here that I haven't talked about. They're not really relevant here. But there's also parameter mapping. If I have any parameters or want to define parameters to this, I can map them to variables or to various other things. I can look at the result set as well as look at defining expressions. Okay. And then there's also a few items down here. So you can browse to a file if that's how you're going to do things. I can build a query. So that opens up. Statement is not supported. Oh, okay. Yeah, because the build query is geared towards writing essentially select statements as opposed to other kinds of statements. So it had trouble with truncate table. But here you do have a pretty decently full-featured query builder. So you can use that as well if, and this is particularly useful if you're joining various tables together and really writing more complex transact SQL. And then I can also parse the query to make sure I haven't done any syntax errors. But in this case, that operation has no effect, as the message says, because bypass prepare property was set to true. So there's no prepare statement set. I'm not going to change that property, but that's that property right there that I would have to change in order to be able to parse the query to make sure that it's syntactically correct. All right, so you have a lot of different options within this task editor. And so this is the first one that I've shown you for the different tasks within the control flow. It's customized for executing SQL. Other tasks that perform other kinds of actions are going to have a different task editor interface because there's different properties, different things you need to do to set it up. But that's all I need to do to set this up. So I'll just go ahead and click on OK. And you notice that the task name changed and the red X is gone. So it means that I have set all of the required properties. Everything's consistent. It still may have errors when it executes, if there's like, say, errors within my Transact SQL code. But as far as the designer can see, integration services can see at this point, everything's fine. That task is ready to go. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is another manual step. Because I want to populate the new hires table with some sample data that's contained within an Excel spreadsheet. In this case, I'm going to use a pre-built package for that purpose. So I'm going to come back over here to Windows Explorer and notice that I have this import new hires.dtsx package. I'm going to double click on that, and that opens up the execute package utility, dtexecui.exe. This is a convenient way to execute packages outside of data tools and outside of Management Studio or on the server. All right, the one thing I need to change here, potentially change here, is here within Connection Managers. So you can see that I have a destination connection, OLEDB. Double click on that to widen the column. As you can see, the data source is local, initial catalog, and AdventureWorks 2012. Provider's fine, it's using integrated security, and so forth. Okay. But if I needed to edit that connection string, I could check the box, and then I'd be able, that makes this text box editable. And so I can make any changes that were required. And then I also have this source connection for Excel, which uses the Microsoft Jet provider. And then it has the package in a specific location. So I actually do need to edit that. So I'm going to come back over here to Windows Explorer. And the package is right there. So the path that I need is that right there. And I'll go back over to the utility here. Oops, I didn't check the box. I'll go back over here and do that. Scroll back over. And I just need to change the path. Okay? All right, so that's now the path for this machine, and I'll press enter. All right, that should be everything I need to do in order to configure this package in order to execute it and import that data into the new hires. So I'll go ahead and click on execute. As you can see, I get a few warnings there. There's some truncation. That's a very common possible issue anytime you're using Excel because Excel really doesn't have data types as such. And it looks like I did have an error. Task validation, warning, parse cannot, connection manager. Okay, looks like it can't make a connection via OLEDB, which means that it's probably some kind of problem with this. So let's see if we can figure this out. So the data source is local, that's fine. Initial catalog, AdventureWorks 2012. And come over here to Object Explorer. Get databases. AdventureWorks is in fact there. It's on the local server. That all looks fine. Provider, that's the native provider. Integrated security, I'm executing this as an administrator. Translate, application name, import new hires, destination connection. Well, it looks like that should execute. but it doesn't. Okay, I'll try one more time just in case the things, yep, something was wrong. Okay, so, okay, query failed validation, returned error code, failed validation, but it seems to be this connection problem. Okay, so we're going to take this a different direction. Okay, so I'm going to go over here to Windows Explorer. As you can see, I have this import new hires.dtsx package. So I'm going to double click on that, and that's going to open that up in the execute package utility. Now, this is a handy little utility that lets you execute packages outside of data tools and outside of SQL Server. Of course, it's using SQL Server behind the scenes, but it's a nice interface for executing packages that you've built. Now, one thing you may need to do when you execute pre-built packages using this tool is that you should probably come into Connection Managers here and take a look at the connection managers that it found within the package. So I have two. I have a connection, OLEDB connection to a SQL Server, and then also one to that Excel file that's going to import the data. So you just want to make sure that executing this package, particularly because you might be executing on a different machine, is going to work okay. So data source local, initial catalog, AdventureWorks 2012, that all looks fine. Using the SQL native client, integrated security, that's all fine. Yeah, so everything looks fine for executing this package through the utility. And then you also want to look at the Excel connection here to make sure in particular that if this is on a different machine, that this path is correct to that employees.xls file. So you may need to make changes. And if you do need to make changes, you just have to click on that checkbox right there, and then that makes that into an editable text box. And so you can change it however you need to. Okay, but both those look fine. Should be able to execute the package. So I'll click on the Execute button. And we get some warnings. Those are usual for Excel data because Excel doesn't really have data types. Everything's coming in with a length of 255, so that's not really a problem. And I know that all the data within that file is going to fit within the fields. Okay, so we passed validation, more truncation warnings. So it's preparing to execute. You can see all the individual steps that go into executing this package. Okay, but looks like it executed successfully. The warnings are not of any consequence, so we're good to go. Okay, now I'm going to go over and open up another file. I'm just going to execute this or open up this verify table load. And this just has some very simple code for checking to make sure that the data is there. So I'll go ahead and execute that. As you can see, we have some data in that table from that spreadsheet. So you can see we have 10 rows. But one little anomaly here is that this is actually double the amount of data. Because what I did is I ran this as a test first and forgot to clear out the staging table. So that doesn't affect what I'm going to be showing you, so we're just going to leave that in there. And so this is from when I inserted the data previously, a little bit earlier today. And then here is the data that I just inserted, these 5 rows there. So you can see that that package works. We have some data within the new hires. Most importantly here is notice that the employee ID starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because this is an identity field within the table. And it's set to start at 1 and increment by 1. All right, so nothing surprising there. All right, so what I'm going to do now is return to the execute package utility, and I'm going to execute this again. All right, just a quick scan. Executes once. It should execute a second time, and it does. And I'll come back over here to Management Studio and re-execute this query. And as you can see, we now have 15 rows. And it continues to use the identity values, building on the previous values, 11 through 15. And in this case, I have 3 sets of duplicates for each of those new hire positions. All right, now I'm going to delete the data. Just execute that statement right there. 15 rows are affected. And then I'm going to come back to the execute package utility and execute this one more time. Okay. Assume it's going to execute correctly. And I'll once again execute the select statement. And you can see that we now have just 5 rows because I had deleted the data and just imported the 5 rows in the table. But notice here that the ID values started at 16. Because just because I deleted the data from that table doesn't mean that the identity value is reset. All right, so to truly reset a table, you need to run the dbcc utility. And that's where that execute SQL package that I created comes into use. All right, so last I'm going to come back over here to Data Tools. So there's that reset staging table component task that I created earlier. So I'm now going to execute this package. And that's going to execute that SQL code. Build happened okay. I have the green icon that indicated that everything executed successfully and everything's good to go. All right, now this is a very simple task, just a couple of SQL statements that execute very quickly. And so you probably didn't see the yellow icon here that's a progress icon. But if the SQL statements within this task took some time to perform, say 5, 10 minutes, 3 hours, whatever it might be, then you would get that rotating yellow icon for as long as that task is executing. And then also if something goes wrong, you get a red X icon instead of this green checkbox. Okay? I can move that down a little bit. Oh, not while it's executing. And then you also saw briefly this output window that indicates that it started and it finished with success. All right, I'm going to stop debugging. I'll just click on that link here, but you can also press Shift F5. Click on that. Okay, so now we're out of debug or execution mode. All right, I'm going to come back over here and once again execute the select statement just to show you that there's nothing in that table. It was truncated and then check ident was reset. So I'm going to come back over here and re-execute this package that imports the Excel data and then execute the select statement one more time. And now notice that we once again have 5 rows in the table, but the employee ID starts with that 100 that I specified to reset the identity value to. And then each subsequent employee is incremented by 1, so 101, 102, 103, and 104.